Chapter 20. Half-truth about "On the rock I will build my church." Honestly, a half-truth can be more dangerous than a lie. This is because people may accept a half-truth as the whole truth, which can lead to misconceptions and misinterpretations. Matthew 16 verse 13 to 18. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" He asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." As we are aware, there has been ongoing debate about the meaning of "this rock" in Matthew 16:18. Some argue that the rock refers to Peter, while others believe it alludes to the declaration, "I am the Christ." Another interpretation suggests that the rock symbolizes God's revelation. Through careful examination, we have clarified that the rock indeed represents God's revelation, as clearly indicated by the context. The church will not be built on Peter's confession, as some people believe. They interpret Jesus' statement to imply, on the revelation that, "I am the Christ, I will build my church." When Jesus builds his church on, "I am the Christ," it actually cancels Peter's blessing. Jesus told Peter, "Blessed are you, Simon son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Therefore, it was the divine source of the revelation that made Peter blessed, rather than the revelation itself. If we claim that the church will be built on Peter's revelation, it would imply that the church can be built on revelations from any source. However, Christ has already denounced revelations originating from human sources, flesh and blood, as deceitful and unreliable, giving them no regard. This is precisely why Jesus told Peter that he was blessed, emphasizing that the revelation Peter received came from God, rather than from human sources. This is because flesh and blood could potentially reveal the same information. Therefore, if the church is built on the confession, "I am the Christ," it would imply that Jesus has accepted to build his church on revelations that could originate from either human sources, flesh and blood, or God. This is because the truth, "I am the Christ," could be revealed through either flesh and blood revelation or divine revelation. If Christ builds the church on, "I am the Christ," then he seemingly disregards the distinction between divine and human revelation. According to Jesus' statement, it is not only God who can reveal the truth, "I am the Christ," but flesh and blood can also reveal it. Both sources can potentially reveal this truth. Therefore, if flesh and blood can reveal it, and God can also reveal it, and Christ says he will build his church on, "I am the Christ," then it implies that he accepts revelation from both sources. If we assume that, "I am the Christ," can only be revealed by God, then it contradicts Jesus' statement. Jesus explicitly stated that this truth can be revealed not only by God but also by flesh and blood, although the latter would not be a source of blessing. Therefore, if Jesus builds his church on, "I am the Christ," without distinguishing between divine and human revelation, it implies that he accepts revelations from both sources, which contradicts his original statement. When you say that Christ will build his church on, "I am the Christ," it's essentially equivalent to saying he will build his church on revelation. This is because both flesh and blood and God can potentially reveal that Jesus is the Christ. However, there is a half-truth in the statement that the church will be built on revelation. Firstly, the "I am the Christ" must indeed be a revelation. Secondly, and more specifically, it must be a revelation from God. If it is a revelation originating from flesh and blood, it will not be a source of blessing. Therefore, whoever believes that the church will be built on, "I am the Christ," is essentially believing that the church will be built on revelation. Consequently, such a person implicitly accepts that Christ can build the church on either a revelation from flesh and blood or a revelation from God. If someone says that the church will be built on revelation, they are partially correct. However, if they fail to clarify which type of revelation the church will be built on, their statement is incomplete and therefore incorrect. The church will indeed be built on revelation, but it must specifically be God's revelation, not a revelation originating from flesh and blood. Therefore, if someone simply states that the church will be built on revelation without further clarification, it implies that the church could be built on either a revelation from flesh and blood or a revelation from God. If the church is built on the revelation, "I am the Christ," then it would imply that even if flesh and blood reveals this truth, it would still qualify. However, Christ would not direct our minds to the statement, "I am the Christ," because doing so would divert our attention away from the source of the revelation. In that case, the source of the revelation would become irrelevant, and all that would matter is the fact that Jesus is the Christ. But Jesus did not teach this. Instead, he emphasized the importance of the source of the revelation. Whoever believes that the church will be built on, "I am the Christ," is essentially believing that the church will be built on revelation. However, Christ will not build his church on revelation. He will never build his church on revelation originating from flesh and blood. While it is crucial to acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ, this truth must be received through God's revelation, not human insight. If flesh and blood can open our eyes to understand God's word, and God can also open our eyes to understand his word, then God will not build his church on his word. Instead, he will build it on the divine act of opening our eyes to understand his word. Similarly, if flesh and blood can open our eyes to understand the Bible, and God can also do so, and he decides to build his church on the Bible, then it implies that he accepts both flesh and blood and divine revelations as valid sources of understanding. When God opens our eyes to his word, that is what brings salvation, and it is at that moment that we receive a blessing. If the church is built on the declaration, "I am the Christ," then the focus shifts from the source of the revelation to the revelation itself. In this scenario, Peter would not be considered blessed, because it was not the revelation itself that brought him the blessing, but rather the divine source of that revelation. Jesus actually directed our attention not to the what, the revelation itself, but rather to the great where, the source of the revelation. If the church is built on, "I am the Christ," then the revelation itself becomes more important than the source of that revelation. However, the truth, "I am the Christ," brings salvation only when it is revealed by God. If flesh and blood reveals it, it will not bring salvation. The declaration, "I am the Christ," is beneficial and significant only when it is revealed by God, but if it is revealed by flesh and blood, it is of no spiritual significance. For a revelation to be truly relevant and important, it must be revealed by God. If the church is built on, "I am the Christ," then two issues arise. Firstly, Peter would no longer be considered blessed, because his blessing came from the divine source of the revelation, not just the revelation itself. Secondly, there would be a contradiction with Christ's statement, as he condemned revelations originating from flesh and blood, stating that they do not bring blessings. If he were to build his church on the revelation, "I am the Christ," without specifying its divine source, it would imply that flesh and blood revelations are also acceptable, which contradicts his previous statement. Therefore, Christ will not build his church on, "I am the Christ." Like the example we quoted, if I say that completing a private college brings a blessing, but completing a public college does not, and then later someone completes a college and I simply say they are blessed without knowing whether it's a private or public college they completed, then it contradicts what I earlier said. By doing so, I would essentially cancel the blessing and shift the focus from the type of college completed to mere college completion. This is not what I initially stated. If I say that worshiping God will lead you to heaven, but worshiping idols will not, and then you tell me you worship, and I respond by saying that since you worship, you will go to heaven without knowing whom you worship, then it contradicts my initial statement. This implies that the act of worship itself is more important than the object of worship. However, in my first statement, I emphasized that the object of worship is more important than the act of worship itself. Assuming that when a black person names a child Kwarteng, it is considered a blessing, but if a white person names a child Kwarteng, it is not a blessing. If you simply say that naming a child Kwarteng is a blessing, it is only partially true. This is because the blessing is specifically tied to a black person giving the name, not just anyone. To be accurate, you should say that it is a blessing to name your child Kwarteng, but only if a black person gives the name. By saying that naming a child Kwarteng is a blessing without specifying the condition, it implies that it is a blessing regardless of whether a white or black person gives the name, which contradicts the original statement. This is a half-truth, and half-truths can be more deceptive and damaging than outright lies. Assuming you are sick and you go to the hospital, and I tell you, blessed are you for going to a government hospital, but not a private hospital, and I add that if I fall sick in the future, I will go to a government hospital. This implies that while it is good to go to any hospital, the blessing specifically comes from going to a government hospital. However, if I later tell you, blessed are you for going to a government hospital, and I say that if I fall sick, I will go to a hospital without specifying whether it's government or private, then my second statement effectively cancels out the blessing I initially mentioned. By saying I will go to any hospital, I imply that I can go to either a government or private hospital, which contradicts my original statement that emphasized the importance of going to a government hospital to receive the blessing. Jesus said Peter was blessed because God revealed the truth to him, rather than flesh and blood. Therefore, if Jesus were to build the church on the revelation, I am the Christ, it would effectively cancel out Peter's blessing. This is because it would imply that the church can be built on any revelation, regardless of whether it comes from flesh and blood or from God, which contradicts the original reason for Peter's blessing. If the church is built on God's revelation, then Peter's blessing is maintained. However, if Christ were to build the church on, I am the Christ, which can be revealed by both flesh and blood and God, then it would imply that God accepts both flesh and blood revelations and his own revelation as equal. This is not the case. Christ will not build his church on the mere declaration, I am the Christ. Instead, he will build it on God's revelation, God's word, and God's voice. He will direct our minds to God's word, emphasizing the importance of the divine source of revelation.